The accusations against Wilks and his funeral home continued to pile up, and the tales became more and more bizarre. The graves of Gladys Baker, buried in 1984, and her son Paul, buried in 1986, were in the Oak Grove Cemetery in Sumner County. Investigators found that Paul Baker was buried in a plastic vault when he was supposed to be in a steel vault. The family also opened the grave of Gladys Baker, but when they found that the vault was in place, they decided not to proceed further. It was reported that Nola Sharkey, Gladys Baker's daughter and Paul Baker's sister, said she had filed a complaint with the State Regulatory Board a week after Paul Baker was buried. She said that Wilks had waited until the morning of the funeral to embalm Baker's body, but he didn't do the embalming at the funeral home. Instead, he embalmed the body in the church vestibule. Sharkey said the odor from the embalming fluid made the church smell so bad that mourners thought the sewer had overflowed. Wilks and an assistant sprayed cans of air freshener during the funeral to mask the odor. She also said that Wilks removed an expensive pair of glasses from Paul Baker's body, and the family had to ask for them to be returned. Walter Lee Redfearing died in early May 1988. He was exhumed on October 17th. A funeral director present at the examination stated that the amount of decomposition present indicated that the body had probably not been embalmed. Redfearing was also missing the vault his family paid for. James Hester, exhumed from the Link Cemetery in Sumner County, was missing his vault, and the body was in a different casket than his family paid for. In nearby Robertson County, an infant's grave was exhumed. The grieving parents bought a coffin and vault for their stillborn daughter, but when the grave was opened, the funeral merchandise Wilks sold the family was not present in the shallow, 1-foot-deep grave. The infant's body was wrapped in a blue plastic bag. During the exhumations, several families hired an attorney who prepared a class action lawsuit against Wilks. The charges would be, among others, breach of contract, fraud, and outrageous conduct. A judge later denied class action status, saying that a series of separate incidents gave rise to the action rather than one incident. There was action proposed against the state of Tennessee's Funeral Directors and Embalmers Board. Their record showed that Wilks had been named in several complaints, but that no action was taken. Some of the complaints were never pursued because the families failed to prepare the correct paperwork for the board. Before his arrest, Wilks was scheduled to appear before the board to explain pricing discrepancies found in inspections. The casket would have one price displayed, and the general price list would have another. Of course, Wilks didn't make the hearing as he was sitting in jail at the time. One of those complaints said that nude photographs were taken of a woman in 1968 while at the funeral home. Wilks denied any knowledge of the incident. Wilks had escaped prosecution 2 years earlier when the family of a man buried without a vault decided not to testify against him. Edgar Smith was dug up in January of 1986, 2 days after he was buried, after the family realized they never saw the vault they paid for. Smith's body was in his casket. Wilks told the family it was all a misunderstanding and buried their father in a new casket and a new vault. Smith's family members filed a complaint with the board, but they were so heavily criticized in the community, they withdrew their complaint. Some in the community, including their own relatives, thought so much of Bobby Wilks that they didn't believe the family's account of the burial. After Smith was reinterred, the grave was periodically probed with a metal rod to ensure the vault, as well as the one in their mother's grave, was still there. In October of 1988, exhumations continued at a record pace. Some 30 families had requested exhumation orders to have the graves opened. In Simpson County, Kentucky, Wilks buried Charles Wayne Hollis in November of 1985 after he was burned beyond recognition in a trailer fire. A vault and casket were in the grave, but the body bag that Wilks said contained the remains were missing. Wilks told the family a body bag was placed in a sealed casket. Instead, Remains found on a plastic covering inside the coffin could not be identified. Coroner Thomas Crafton said there was really no way to know if it was Hollis's body. Also opened on October 18th was the grave of Flossie Burnett Estes at a church cemetery in Olinda, Tennessee. Estes was buried without a vault. The casket was filled with bags of garbage and the casket had caved in. Found under the casket were 4 damaged foot markers from nearby graves. Another grave in White House, Tennessee was opened, but the family decided not to push further when a vault was found in the grave. To no one's surprise, it was not the vault they paid for. The findings in the graves kept getting worse. The body of Gladys Birdwell Chubb was buried in the Owens Chapel at United Methodist Church in 1978, making it the oldest one exhumed so far. Her grave was opened on October 19th. Clubb's decomposed body was in the vault and family the casket paid for. A ring and necklace that had been placed on her were found, along with 2 embalming fluid bottles and 2 bottles of ski soda, one of which had never been opened. Clubb's daughter said, "They better keep that under lock and key. I could make one phone call and have him killed. He does not put garbage in my mother's grave." That same day, authorities dug up the body of Lucille Kleinert at the Olinda Cemetery. Wilks buried her not in the vault her family ordered, but in a steel box. When they opened the casket, embalming fluid bottles, empty dog food cans, and editions of 3 different newspapers from the week she died were with her. The family said they were raised within a half-mile of Barber's funeral home and had known Wilks all their lives. October 22nd brought 2 more exhumations. Amazingly, the grave of a teenager buried in 1984 was found to be intact. The correct vault and casket, and no garbage in the casket. The elation the exhumation company had at finding a correct burial was short-lived. At the Mount Carmel Baptist Church, the grave of Bobby York was opened. He was buried on September 12th, making his grave one of the most recent ones. His casket was not in the vault paid for, but in a metal box. When the casket was opened, nobody was surprised when an empty milk carton, soft drink bottles, a cat food can, and an empty embalming fluid bottle were inside. One of the most bizarre moments came when the marker from another grave was found under the casket pillow. The small marker had the name Sarah Elizabeth Brown and the dates 1897 to 1952. Investigators had no idea who Sarah Elizabeth Brown was, where the marker came from, or most importantly, why it was in the casket. The exhumations were complete about the end of October. The excavating companies said they would continue to dig if families were willing. Perhaps families believed that Wilks had done them right, and further revelations would damage Wilks' reputation even further. It could be that the community was tiring of the scandal and wanted nothing more to be revealed. Think of it this way. No one knows how many improper burials there were. But think of this. We know Bobby Wilks started in the funeral business in the mid-1960s. The first improper burial was discovered in 1988. No one knows when Wilks started dumping caskets and stealing vaults, but from the mid-1960s to the late 1980s, I will just leave it to your imagination. Either way, feelings ran deep in Robertson and Sumner counties. District Attorney General Dent Morris said a grand jury in Robertson was scheduled for January of 1989, but that if circumstances warranted, a special session could be called. Morris also said that the evidence obtained during the investigations, no matter how old, could be used in court. The statute of limitations in Tennessee for fraud is 4 years, but since the evidence was buried, the statute of limitations was told. Wilks and his son Gary appeared in Sumner County Court in November and were bound to the grand jury in that county. During that hearing, their attorney entered not guilty pleas. After the hearing, a statement from Bobby Wilks was released to the media. Wilks said, "I'm sorry it happened. I didn't mean to harm anyone." In October 20th, the state board suspended Wilks' funeral directors and embalmers' licenses for the improper burials, which closed the doors on the Barber funeral homes in Milldale and White House. Secondary was the fact that he was fined $1,000 for the pricing violations. In November, the board formally revoked the licenses, finding him guilty of immoral and unprofessional conduct. The board's attorney said that Wilks demonstrated depravity and cold-bloodedness on a scale never seen before. He also said that the evidence showed a clear pattern of Wilks' desecration of human remains and graves. In November 1988, the Sumner County Grand Jury met and indicted Bobby Wilks and his son, Gary, for charges related to the burials of James Roth and James Hester. The senior Wilks was indicted on 2 counts and his son 1 count of larceny by false pretenses. A trial date was set for the Sumner County charges on January 17, 1989, but that trial, like most others, there would be delays. Similar charges were pending in Robertson County. Bobby was indicted in January on 25 counts of obtaining property under false pretenses, 25 counts of attempting to commit a felony, and 21 counts of improper handling of a dead body. His son Gary was indicted on 2 counts of obtaining or attempting to obtain money under false pretenses and 1 count of improperly handling a dead body in connection with the burial of Brenny Crowder, who was buried in 1981 without the vault. Gary Wilks was later found guilty on the charges in both counties and wound up serving time and paying a $750 fine. Sadly, his freedom wasn't the only thing Gary Wilks lost. He lost his family as well. His wife and young daughter left him after the scandal broke. His wife said she felt constantly threatened because of her last name. She also said she had information that would help prosecutors. She said her husband had given her 5 rings, a gold chain, 3 pairs of earrings, and a bracelet that she suspected were taken from corpses, which would solidify the statements of family members whose loved ones were exhumed with personal items missing. Bobby Wilks' indictment was sealed, but Gary Wilks' indictment was public, and it is a classic. That indictment said that Gary, unlawfully, shockingly, unnecessarily, lewdly, offensively, disgustingly, outrageously, and with total disregard for the commonly accepted principles of morality and simple common decency, did handle a human body, the dead mortal remains of Brenny Crowder, in a manner which offends the public sense of decency and morals by failure to install a vault as ordered by the family of the deceased. That just about covers it. And if that wasn't enough, Geraldo Rivera came to town and taped an interview with Jackie Flatt's family to discuss the improper burials. Flatt's mother, uncle, and brother-in-law were all victims of Wilks' fraud scheme. In April of 1989, Wilks was offered a plea deal of 20 years imprisonment in Robertson County in exchange for a guilty plea. Wilks' attorney, Mike Crawford, rejected that deal. Family members of the deceased persons didn't like that at all, with one saying 20 years wasn't enough. May of 1989 saw Bobby Wilks in a courtroom in Sumner County where he pled guilty to 2 counts of grand larceny by false pretenses. He faced a maximum of 12 years on those charges, and again, family members said that 12 years wasn't enough time to compensate them for the anguish they had suffered. In September, he was sentenced to 4.5 years for the improper burials of Joseph Roth and James Ollie Hester. That would clear out the Sumner County cases. Robertson County prosecutors were waiting their turn. Rather than go to trial, Bobby Wilks pled guilty to 71 counts of burial fraud in exchange for a 23-year sentence. Wilks would have to serve